Red Rock, Texas, a town of dust, danger, and desperate hope. Two children's fate is hanging by a thread, and a solitary rancher's choice will ripple through generations. Will justice prevail, and can kindness survive in a harsh, unforgiving land? Watch closely. The story that unfolds will leave you in awe. What we learn is timeless. Every act of compassion creates a chain reaction of hope, changing lives in ways we may never see. If this journey moved you, like, comment, share. Let's continue discovering the heart of the American West together.
Red Rock, Texas, 1878. It was the kind of town maps usually forgot. A single dusty street, wooden buildings leaning against each other like tired drunks. And at the end of it all, the Red Rock Saloon. Loudest place in town. Brightest, too. Out back, it was just shadows. Sam stood at the alley door. He was 9 years old, looked closer to 50 in the eyes. Clara stood right behind him, 7 years old. Her hands gripped the back of his ragged shirt like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Sam knocked. 1 time, 2 times. The heavy wooden door swung open. The smell of roasted meat hit them like a physical blow. The saloon's cook looked down. His face was slick with sweat. His eyes were hard. "You two again. I told you yesterday." "Scram?" Sam didn't flinch. He didn't hold out his hand. "Just bones, mister. Beef bones. For soup. My sister hasn't ate since yesterday." The cook wiped his hands on a filthy apron. "Not my problem. Town is full of strays. We don't feed rats. Get out of here before I toss boiling water out this door." The door slammed. The lock clicked. Sam stood perfectly still. He reached back, patted Clara's hand. "It's all right. We'll try the livery next." He turned. They started walking, and then Clara stopped. Her knees just gave out. She hit the red dirt without making a sound. Sam dropped beside her. "Clara, hey, look at me." Across the street, Martha Abigail Higgins stopped walking. She had a basket of mending on her arm. She had 3 unpaid bills waiting on her kitchen table. She had a banker breathing down her neck for her dead husband's debts. She didn't have room in her life for anything else. But she watched the boy brushing dirt off the little girl's face, doing it with hands that were shaking. Martha set her basket down. She didn't think about the bills. She just walked across the dusty road. "Let me help you," she said. Sam scrambled up. He put himself between Martha and Clara, a tiny, furious shield. "We didn't steal nothing. We were just resting." Martha stopped, looked at the boy, looked at the hollows in the little girl's cheeks. "I know you didn't steal," Martha said. Her voice was quiet. "Steady. I made chicken stew this morning. Too much for one person. It's going to go bad if I don't get some help eating it." Sam's jaw tightened. "We don't have money to pay you." "I didn't ask for money, and we don't take charity." Martha held his gaze. She didn't force a smile. She just offered a hand. "Then consider it a favor to me. Come on. The wind is picking up." Martha S.'s house was small. 1 room for sewing, 1 for living. It was poor, but it was spotless. She set 2 deep bowls of stew on the table, thick cuts of chicken, potatoes, warm bread on the side. Clara ate carefully, like she was afraid the food might disappear if she blinked. Sam ate fast, keeping one eye on the door, keeping one eye on Martha. When the bowls were scraped clean, Sam pushed his chair back. He stood up straight. "We'll chop wood for this," Sam said. His chin was held high, too high. "I meant what I said. We don't need your pity." "Ma'am." Martha stopped clearing the table. She turned around. She wiped her hands on a cloth, walked over, and knelt down so she was right at Sam's eye level. She'd soften her words. She made sure he heard every single one. "Listen to me, Samuel," Martha said, her voice ringing clear and firm in the small room. "I don't pity you. I respect you. Poverty is not a crime, and an empty stomach never diminishes a person's dignity. You hear me? You have a right to be fed. That is a fundamental human right. It is not charity to feed a hungry child. It is what human beings are supposed to do for each other. Sam stared at her. The tough, hard shell he wore seemed to crack just for a second. His lower lip trembled. He bit it hard. Clara looked up from her empty bowl. "You smell like lavender," she whispered. "My mama smelled like that." Martha closed her eyes for a heartbeat. Then she stood up. "It's getting dark," she said softly. "And it's cold outside. You two are staying here tonight. I'll make up pallets on the floor." Sam didn't argue. For the first time in a long time, he just nodded. Outside, the night had finally swallowed Red Rock. A lone rider came down the main street. Arthur Pendleton. Big man, big horse. The kind of silence around him that made other men step out of the way. He was heading back to his ranch, 2,000 acres of empty space. 7 years of quiet since his wife died. He didn't stop at the saloon. He never did. But as he rode past Martha Higgins's house, he pulled gently on the reins. The big Appaloosa slowed to a halt. Arthur looked at the lit window. Through the thin curtains, he could see 3 shadows. A woman pulling a blanket over 2 small figures. He sat there in the saddle, just watching. A cold wind blew off the plains, kicking up the red dust. Arthur pulled his collar up. He didn't say a word. He just touched his spurs to the horse's flanks and rode out into the dark. Morning came hot to Red Rock. The sun baked the wooden sidewalks. Dust devils spun down the center of the street. It was a harsh place, a place that didn't forgive mistakes. Arthur Pendleton pushed through the swinging doors of the Red Rock Saloon. It was quiet, too early for the drunks. Smelled like stale beer, tobacco smoke, and pine sawdust. Bea Gallagher stood behind the long oak bar. She was wiping down the wood, heavy arms, kind eyes. She ran this place like a captain runs a ship. Arthur walked over. His boots thumped hard against the floorboards. He didn't speak. He just reached into his coat, pulled out 3 silver dollars, set them on the bar. "Morning, Arthur," Bea said. She scooped up the coins. "Your table in the corner is paid up for the month. Not that you ever use it for drinking." "Just business," Arthur said. His voice was low, gravelly, like a wheel turning over dry rocks. Before Bea could say another word, the saloon doors swung open again. Silas Vance walked in. He wore a tailored 3-piece suit, dark wool, crisp white shirt, a gold pocket watch chained to his vest. He looked entirely out of place in a dusty saloon, but he owned half the buildings in town. He wanted the other half. Silas walked to the bar. He stood a few feet from Arthur. He didn't look at him. "Coffee, Bea," Silas ordered. "Black, and wipe this counter first. It's filthy." Bea's jaw tightened. She wiped the counter, poured the coffee. Silas took a sip. He grimaced. "You hear the latest joke in town, Bea?" Bea didn't answer. She just kept wiping the bar. "Martha Higgins," Silas chuckled. "A thin, cold sound. The widow. She can barely afford the roof over her head. And now she is taking in street trash. Those 2 beggar brats from the alley. Sam and whatever the girl's name is." Arthur stopped breathing for a second. His large, calloused hands rested flat on the bar. "They're just kids, Silas," Bea said softly. "They had nowhere to go." "They belong in a workhouse," Silas snapped. "Or out of my town entirely. They're a nuisance, rummaging through alleys, bringing the whole property value of the street down. People like that, they don't have a future. They don't belong among decent, hard-working folk. They're weeds." Arthur turned his head, slowly. He looked at Silas, really looked at him. The banker was a small man trying to cast a large shadow. Arthur didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. When he spoke, the whole room seemed to get perfectly quiet. "You're wrong, Silas." Silas blinked. He turned to Arthur, a sneer forming on his lips. "Excuse me, Pendleton. Did you say something?" Arthur turned his whole body now. He faced the banker. He stood a full head taller. "I said you're wrong," Arthur repeated. His words were measured, heavy. "You sit in your bank and you look at ledgers. You think numbers tell you what a person is worth. But let me tell you something clearly. A man's worth isn't measured by the acres in his bank account, Silas. It's measured by how he bends down to lift up those weaker than himself." Silas scoffed. "Spare me the sermon, Arthur." Arthur took one step closer. The air in the room felt thick. "It's no sermon," Arthur said. His voice was absolute, unshakable. "Every child has an equal right to live and grow. It doesn't matter if they sleep in a mansion or behind a stable. Their dignity isn't tied to the clothes on their back. You treat those children like trash because they are poor. But the only real poverty in this room is the poverty of your conscience. You forget that equality is the right of every living soul. You forget what makes us human." Silas' face flushed deep red. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this. Not in Red Rock. Not by anyone. He slammed his coffee cup down on the bar. Coffee spilled over the rim. "You keep talking like that, Arthur," Silas hissed, "and you'll find doing business in this town very difficult." "I don't do business with cowards," Arthur said. Silas glared at him for a long, ugly second. Then he spun on his heel. He pushed through the swinging doors and stormed out into the street. Arthur watched him go. He didn't smile. He just turned back to the bar. "Well," Bia let out a long breath. "I've been waiting 5 years for somebody to say that to him." "It needed saying," Arthur replied. He turned toward the door to leave. And he froze. Martha Higgins was standing just inside the entrance. She held a bundle of neatly folded dresses in her arms. She must have walked in right after Silas. She had heard the whole thing. Arthur looked at her. Martha looked back. She was wearing a faded gray dress. Her hair was pulled back tight. There were dark circles under her eyes. But she stood tall. Her chin was up. In that moment, Arthur didn't see a poor widow. He saw a queen, a woman fighting a war with nothing but a sewing needle and sheer grit. Martha's eyes were wide. She was searching his face, looking for the catch, looking for the reason a rich rancher would defend two ragged orphans against the most powerful man in town. Arthur couldn't hold her gaze. The weight of it was too much. It dug up things in his chest he had buried 7 years ago. He tipped his hat, a sharp, quick nod. He walked past her, out the doors, into the blinding Texas sun, leaving Martha standing in the quiet saloon, holding her bundle of dresses, staring at the empty space where he had just been. 3 days passed. The heat held steady. The town hummed with its usual desperate energy. But at the Pendleton Ranch, things were shifting. Arthur couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara hitting the dirt. He saw Sam standing in front of her, a 9-year-old boy trying to hold up the world. He saw Martha, the fierce pride in her eyes. On Wednesday morning, Arthur saddled his big Appaloosa. He rode into town. He didn't go to the feed store. He didn't go to the blacksmith. He went straight to the Red Rock Saloon. Bia was behind the bar, polishing glasses. The place was empty again. Arthur liked it that way. He walked up to the bar. He carried a heavy leather sack. He didn't sit down. He dropped the sack on the polished oak. It hit with a deep, heavy thud, the sound of solid coin. Bia stopped wiping the glass. She looked at the sack. Then she looked at Arthur. "What's this?" she asked. "The price," Arthur said. "The price for what?" "This place." Arthur tapped the bar with his knuckles. The building, the business, everything inside it. Bea stared at him. She let out a short, nervous laugh. Arthur, I'm not selling. I built this place. I know, Arthur said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the bar next to the money. Read it. Bea wiped her hands. She picked up the paper. It was a contract. Drawn up neat and proper. It offered her double what the saloon was worth. But that wasn't the part that made her eyes widen. It was the bottom paragraph, written in Arthur's own bold handwriting. The kitchen of this establishment shall provide a hot, free meal to any orphan's child who walks through the front doors. They are never to be sent to the back alley. Bea read it once. She read it twice. Her hand started to shake. She looked up at Arthur. Her eyes were wet. You're buying my saloon, she whispered. Just to feed those two kids? I'm buying it so they don't have to knock on the back door anymore, Arthur said. You stay on as manager. You run the day-to-day. You keep half the profits. I just own the deed, and I own the kitchen. Bea looked at the pile of money. She looked at the man standing in front of her, a man who hadn't smiled in 7 years. Arthur Pendleton, she said, her voice cracking. You are a crazy, stubborn fool. Will you sign? Bea picked up a pen. She dipped it in the inkwell. She signed her name at the bottom of the page. Done, she said. By noon, the whole town knew. Secrets didn't survive long in Red Rock. Martha heard it from the baker. She was buying a loaf of day-old bread when the man leaned over the counter and whispered the news. Arthur Pendleton bought the saloon. He ordered the kitchen open for the orphans. Martha didn't walk home. She turned around. She marched straight down the main street, right out of town, and took the dirt road leading up to the Pendleton ranch. It was a 2-mile walk. The sun beat down on her shoulders. Her boots kicked up red dust. She didn't slow down. She was angry. She was confused. She felt a strange, tightening panic in her chest. When she reached the ranch, Arthur was out by the stables. He was brushing down his horse. Smooth, even strokes. He heard her footsteps crunching on the gravel. He didn't look surprised when he turned around. Martha stopped 10 feet away. She was breathing hard. A strand of hair had fallen loose and stuck to her sweaty cheek. Why? She demanded. No greeting, no pleasantries. Why did you do it? Arthur kept brushing the horse. I wanted a good investment. Don't lie to me, Martha snapped. She stepped closer. You spent a fortune. You bought a liquor joint. And you wrote a rule about feeding children. Why my children? Why are you doing this? Arthur stopped. He rested his hand on the horse's back. He looked at Martha. He saw the fear under her anger, the fear of someone who is used to every gift having a hidden trap. He walked over to the wooden fence. He leaned against it, facing her. Because I saw them, Martha, Arthur said. His voice was low, steady. I saw that boy asking for bones. I saw that little girl fall in the dirt. They're not your responsibility, she said defensively. Arthur shook his head. He looked her dead in the eye, and he delivered the truth, plain and heavy. No child in this free country should have to knock on a back door to beg for scraps, Arthur said. His words rang clear in the quiet ranch yard. It is a matter of human rights, Martha. This saloon sells liquor to men, but from today it sells dignity to children. Nobody should be made to feel like an animal just because they are hungry. Respect is a right, not a privilege. Martha stared at him. The fight drained right out of her. Her shoulders dropped. She had never heard a man speak like that. Not here. Not in a world where money was the only law. But why? She whispered. Why go this far? For 2 strangers? Arthur looked away. He looked out over the vast rolling plains of his ranch. The wind rustled the dry grass. He stayed quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, His voice was different, softer, older. 7 years ago, Arthur said. He didn't look at her. In Kansas, Abilene. Martha stayed perfectly still. She didn't want to break the spell. I was a younger man, hot-headed, got into a dispute over some cattle lines. 3 men jumped me behind a livery stable. One of them had a knife, caught me in the ribs. Arthur touched his side absent-mindedly. I went down in the mud. They ran. I was bleeding out. Fast. It was dark. Nobody was coming. I laid there waiting to die. He took a slow breath. A man found me, a stranger. He didn't know me from Adam. He could have walked past, kept himself out of trouble. But he didn't. He dragged me out of the mud, carried me to his rooming house. He tied off the wound, kept pressure on it all night, stayed by my side for 3 days until the fever broke. Arthur turned his head. He looked back at Martha. His dark eyes were swimming in ghosts. I asked him why he did it. He just smiled. He said, "People help people. That's the only rule that matters." His name was William Barrett. Martha gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. "William Barrett," she repeated. That's Sam and Clara's real father." Arthur finished. "I found out a month ago," Reverend Josiah told me. "William died of consumption last year. I didn't know. I didn't know he had kids. I didn't know they were in that orphanage, or that they ended up here, sleeping in alleys." Arthur pushed off the fence. He stood tall. The pain in his face hardened into absolute resolve. "I couldn't save William," Arthur said quietly. "I couldn't pay him back when he was alive, but I can pay his children. I owe him my life, Martha. Buying a saloon is a cheap price to pay to keep his kids from starving." Martha stood frozen. The wind whipped her faded skirt around her legs. She looked at Arthur Pendleton. Really looked at him, the silent rancher. The man the whole town thought was just cold and empty. He wasn't empty, he was full. He was carrying debts of honor that most men would have abandoned years ago. "You didn't just buy them food," Martha said. Her voice trembled slightly. "You bought them a front door." "Yes, ma'am," Arthur said. They stood there in the yard, between the stables and the wide-open sky. A shift happened right then, invisible but heavy. The space between them got a little smaller. "Sam won't take it as charity," Martha warned him. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. "He's too proud." Arthur nodded. "I know. He's got his father's spine. Tell him the saloon needs a boy to sweep the porch, 1 hour a day. In exchange for 2 meals, he works for it." Martha S. smile grew. It reached her eyes. "You're a clever man, Mr. Pendleton. Just trying to balance the ledger, Mrs. Higgins." Martha turned to walk back to town. She stopped after a few steps. She looked over her shoulder. "Arthur," she called out. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked down the dirt road, her step lighter than it had been in 2 years. Arthur stood by the fence. He watched her until she was just a small speck against the Texas horizon. For the first time in 7 years, Arthur Pendleton felt like he could finally breathe. The routine settled in and like dust on a window. Still quiet. Steady. Every morning at 10, Sam showed up at the Red Rock Saloon. He took a heavy straw broom from the back closet. He swept the front porch, every plank, every corner. He didn't rush. He worked like a man getting paid a date. When he finished, Bea gave him 2 plates of hot food. One for him, one for Clara. They ate at a table near the window. Not in the alley, not in the dirt. At noon, they walked out to the Pendleton Ranch. Arthur didn't ask them to come. He never formally invited them. But the first time they showed up, walking down that long dirt road, Arthur just pointed to a water bucket and a brush. "Start with the gray mare," Arthur had said. That was it. The agreement was struck. It was a Tuesday. The sun was high and unforgiving. The air smelled of dry pine and horse sweat. Sam stood inside the corral. He was holding a lead rope. At the other end was a young Mustang, skittish, wild-eyed. The horse danced nervously, kicking up little clouds of red dust. Sam yanked the rope, hard. He was trying to show the horse who was boss, trying to be tough. The Mustang reared back. It snorted, pulling the rope tight, nearly lifting Sam off his feet. "Let it go, slack, Sam." Arthur's voice came from the fence. Arthur climbed over the wooden rails. He didn't run. He just walked, slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. He reached out and put his large hand over Sam's small white-knuckled grip on the rope. "You can't muscle a creature that weighs 1,000 pounds, Arthur said. His voice was a low rumble. "And you can't scare respect into them. Fear just makes them unpredictable." Sam looked up. He was sweating. "He won't listen." "He's listening," Arthur said. "He just doesn't like what you're saying." Arthur took the rope. He didn't pull. He just stood there. He lowered his shoulders. He took a slow, deep breath. The Mustang stopped pulling. It flicked its ears toward Arthur. "A horse feels what you feel," Arthur said softly, his eyes on the animal. "If you're angry, he's angry. If you're scared, he's scared. You want him to calm down? You have to calm down first." Arthur took one step forward. He reached out a hand. He didn't reach for the face. He reached for the shoulder, the safe spot. He patted the horse neck, slow, heavy pats. The Mustang let out a long breath. The tension melted out of its muscles. Arthur handed the rope back to Sam. "Gentleness isn't weakness, Sam. It's the only real strength there is. Try again." Sam took the rope. He forced his shoulders down. He took a breath. He walked forward, reached out, and touched the horse's neck. The Mustang didn't flinch. Across the yard, under the sprawling branches of a massive oak tree, Clara sat in the shade. She didn't care about the horses. She was busy. For the first few days, she had drawn in the dirt with the stick. Outlines of houses, fences, chimneys. But today, she had real tools. Arthur had walked past her that morning, dropped a thick pad of paper and a piece of soft charcoal in her lap, and kept walking. She was drawing the Pendleton Ranch, but she was adding things. She drew Arthur, she drew Sam, and on the porch, she drew Martha. Arthur walked over to the water trough. He pumped the iron handle. Cold water splashed into the basin. He splashed some on his face, wiping the sweat and dust from his eyes. Sam walked up beside him. He pumped the water, cupped his hands, and drank. The boy wiped his mouth on his sleeve. He leaned against the wooden trough. He looked at Arthur, really looked at him. "You don't talk much, do you?" Sam asked. Arthur looked down at the boy. "Saying nothing is better than saying something foolish." Sam kicked at a rock with his worn-out boot. "Martha says you lost your wife a long time ago." Arthur went perfectly still. The wind seemed to stop. "She did," Arthur said. "My pa died last year," Sam said. His voice didn't shake. He stated it like a fact of the weather. "Sometimes I feel like there's a rock sitting on my chest. Heavy, makes it hard to breathe. And when I look at you, Mr. Pendleton, you look like you got a rock on your chest, too. Your eyes are always sad." Arthur looked at the 9-year-old boy. I saw the grief in Sam's eyes, a mirror of his own. Arthur sat down on the edge of the water trough. He rested his forearms on his knees. He looked at the ground for a long time. Then he looked at Sam. "I do have a rock on my chest, Sam," Arthur said quietly. "Have for 7 years. "Does it ever go away?" Sam asked. Arthur shook his head. He didn't want to lie to the boy. He needed to tell him the truth. "No," Arthur said, his voice carrying clearly over the quiet yard. "The pain of losing a loved one never truly vanishes, Samuel. But when we dare to share that pain with others, it becomes a bridge connecting our souls rather than a wall imprisoning us in the past. Sam listened. He let the words sink in. You've been hiding behind a wall, Sam said. I have, Arthur admitted. But lately I think I've been finding a door. Sam looked over at Clara under the tree. He looked back at Arthur. I'm glad you bought that saloon, Sam said. So am I, Arthur said. That evening, the sun went down in a blaze of orange and purple. Arthur found himself standing on Martha Higgins' front porch. He held his hat in one hand. In the other, he held a basket of fresh vegetables from his garden. He knocked. Martha opened the door. She looked surprised. Then she smiled. It was a good smile. It made the tired lines around her eyes disappear. Mr. Pendleton, she said. Brought some carrots and potatoes, Arthur said, holding out the basket. Heard you were making a roast. I am. And there's plenty of it. Come in. Arthur stepped inside. The house was warm. It smelled like roasting meat and rosemary. Sam was setting the table. Clara was sitting on the floor, showing Martha her drawing of the ranch. Arthur hung his hat on a peg. They sat at the small wooden table. 4 people. Passing plates, pouring water. Nobody talked about debts. Nobody talked about the past. They talked about the horses. They talked about Clara's drawings. Arthur watched Martha laugh at something, Sam said. He watched the way the lantern light caught the red in her hair. He realized he wasn't eating fast. He wasn't rushing back to the empty silence of his ranch. He was just sitting. He was just breathing. The ice that had covered Arthur Pendleton's heart for 7 long years didn't shatter all at once. That night, at a crowded little table in a poor widow's house, it began to melt. Trouble never knocks in Red Rock. It just kicks the door. Thursday morning. She was pinning the hem of a cotton dress. Her fingers worked fast. Needle in, needle out, rhythm. The bell above her shop door chimed. Martha didn't look up. Be right with you. Just finishing this seam. Take your time, Mrs. Higgins. The voice was smooth. Too smooth, like oiled glass. Martha froze. She lowered her hands. She stood up and turned around. Silas Vance stood in the center of her sewing room. He wore his usual 3-piece suit. He held a silver-tipped walking stick. He looked around the modest room with absolute disgust. Mr. Vance, Martha said. Her voice was cold. I didn't request a meeting. I don't wait for requests, Silas said. He stepped closer to her work table. He picked up a spool of thread, examined it, and dropped it back down. I came to discuss your husband, Thomas. Martha S.'s stomach tightened. Thomas is dead. Yes, a tragedy. The mine collapse, Silas said, though he didn't sound tragic at all. But his signature is very much alive. Right here. Silas reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded ledger page. He placed it on the table, right over the dress Martha was pinning. When Thomas borrowed money to buy his mining equipment, he put this house up as collateral, Silas said, smoothly. The terms were generous, but the grace period ends next week. You owe the bank $400, Mrs. Higgins, by Friday. Martha stared at the paper. The numbers blurred. $400. She might as well owe $1 million. She didn't have 40. You know I don't have that kind of money, Martha said. Her voice was tight. I know, Silas smiled. A thin, bloodless smile. Which is why I'm here. I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to take the deed to this house and the land it sits on. In exchange, I'll clear the debt. You'll have until the end of the month to vacate. Martha felt the blood drain from her face. Vacate? Where am I supposed to go? I have 2 children to care for.
Those street rats?
Silas chuckled. They aren't yours. Let them go back to the alley where they belong. As for you, I'm sure you'll find a boarding house. Good day, Mrs. Higgins. Silas tipped his hat. He turned and walked out. Martha stood alone in the room. The silence was deafening. She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. She needed a loan. She needed an extension. She needed a miracle. An hour later, Martha walked into the Red Rock Saloon. She wasn't there to ask Arthur for money. She would rather swallow glass than beg. She was there to see Bea. Bea knew everyone. Bea knew the circuit judges. Maybe Bea knew a legal loophole. The saloon was quiet. It was early afternoon. Martha walked to the back office. The door was cracked open. Bea? Martha called out softly. No answer. Martha pushed the door open. The office was empty. Bea must have been in the cellar. Martha stepped inside to wait. She stood by Bea's large oak desk. It was cluttered with inventory lists, whiskey receipts, and order forms. And right in the center, sitting open in a leather folder, was the contract. The contract that Arthur Pendleton had signed 3 days ago. Martha didn't mean to snoop, she truly didn't, but the bold ink caught her eye. She saw her own handwriting on some dresses, and she recognized a legal document when she saw one. She leaned closer. She read the top paragraph. Sale of property, Red Rock Saloon. Transferred from Beatrice Gallagher to Arthur Pendleton. And then she saw the attached document and underneath it. A letter from the Red Rock Bank, signed by Silas Vance. Notice of foreclosure. Debt owed $800. Deadline, Tuesday the 14th. Martha stopped breathing. Arthur hadn't bought the saloon on a whim. He hadn't bought it just because he saw 2 starving children in an alley. He bought it to bail Bea out. Silas Vance was going to take the saloon from Bea, just like he was trying to take Martha's house. Arthur stepped in with his deep pockets and bought the debt. He saved the saloon. Martha stepped back from the desk. The free meals for the orphans. The big, grand gesture. It wasn't the main reason. It was an afterthought. A secondary clause tacked on to a real estate deal. A cold, ugly feeling crawled up Martha's throat. Betrayal. She felt foolish. She had thought Arthur did it entirely for Sam and Clara. She had started to trust him. She had let him sit at her table. She had looked at him and thought he was a savior, but he was just a businessman playing a game of chess with Silas Vance. And he used the orphans as a shield to make himself look like a saint. The door creaked behind her. Martha spun around. Bea stood in the doorway, holding a crate of lemons. Bea looked at Martha. Then she looked at the open folder on the desk. Bea set the crate down. She wiped her hands on her apron. You read it, Bea said quietly. You were in debt to Vance, Martha said. Her voice was shaking. Not from fear, but from anger. Silas was going to foreclose on you. That's why Arthur bought this place. To bail you out, not for the children. Bea sighed. She walked around the desk and closed the folder. Martha, he used them, Martha interrupted. Her eyes flashed out with fierce protective fire. He used my children as a noble excuse to cover up a business war with Silas. He wanted to look like a hero to the town while he bought up prime real estate. Stop it right there, Bea said. Her voice cracked like a whip. It was loud and firm. Martha blinked, taken aback. Bea stood tall. She pointed a heavy finger at Martha. Don't let suspicion blind you, Martha, Bea said, speaking with absolute authority. You listen to me, and you listen well. Protecting an older woman from bankruptcy and feeding starving orphans are not mutually exclusive. It is our moral duty to protect one another when society turns its backs back. Arthur didn't have to save me, and he certainly didn't have to write that clause for those kids. He could have just bought the place and kicked us all out. Martha crossed her arms. He bought the place because of you, Bea. The kids were just a convenient afterthought. No, a deep voice said from the doorway. Martha turned. Arthur Pendleton stood there. His hat was in his hand. His face was unreadable. He walked into a cramped office. He looked at Bea, then focused entirely on Martha. "I knew about Bea S. debt for a month," Arthur said. His voice was calm, unhurried. "I didn't do anything about it. I mind my own business. That's how I survive." Martha stared at him. "Then why did you buy it?" Arthur stepped closer. He didn't look away from her. "I bought it," Arthur said, "because I saw Clara hit the dirt. I bought it because I saw Sam trying to hold her up. That was the moment. That was the trigger." He looked down at the floor, then back up. "I could have just paid Bea's debt," Arthur continued, "but Silas would have found another way to ruin her. I bought the deed so Silas could never touch this place again. And I wrote that clause because no child should ever starve in a town with a full kitchen. I didn't use them, Martha. They were the reason I finally decided to step out of the dark." Martha looked at him. She looked at the raw honesty in his dark eyes. She felt the anger drain out of her. It was replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. "Silas was at my house this morning," Martha whispered. The fight was suddenly gone from her voice. "He has the deed to my house. Thomas borrowed against it. I have a week to pay $400 or he throws us out," Bea gasped. Arthur didn't gasp. His jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck pulled tight. $400, Arthur said softly. "I don't want your money, Arthur," Martha said immediately. She lifted her chin, the pride returning. "I'll figure it out. I needed to know you weren't playing games with us." "I don't play games, Martha," Arthur said. He didn't offer to pay it. He knew she wouldn't let him. Not yet. He respected her too much to treat her like a charity case. "You figure out what you can," Arthur said, putting his hat back on. "And if you need a place to stand while you fight him, my ranch has plenty of room." He tipped his hat to Bea. He tipped it to Martha, and he walked out. Martha stood in the office. The air felt lighter. The truth was out. The fracture hadn't broken them. It had just shown her what kind of iron Arthur Pendleton was really made of. She turned to Bea. "I've got a lot of sewing to do," Martha said. Bea smiled. "I'll put on a pot of coffee." The Red Rock schoolhouse was a single room built of raw pine. It sat on the edge of town, where the dirt road met the open prairie. It held 30 kids, ranged from 6 to 14. It smelled of chalk dust, old sweat, and wet wool when it rained. On a hot Thursday afternoon, it just smelled like heat and restless energy. Recess. The kids were out in the yard, running, shouting, kicking a stuffed leather ball. Clara wasn't running. She sat under the sparse shade of a mesquite tree. She had a stick. She was drawing a horse in the dry red dirt. She was quiet. She was always quiet. Sam stood a few yards away, leaning against the rough wood of the schoolhouse wall, watching her, always watching her. Then came Billy Vance. Billy was 11. He was big for his age, thick around the middle. He wore a crisp white shirt and store-bought leather boots that shined. He walked with his chest puffed out. He walked like his father owned the town, which for the most part, his father did. Billy walked straight toward the mesquite tree. He didn't look down. He stepped right in the middle of Clara's drawing. He ground his shiny boot into the dirt, wiping out the horse's head. Clara looked up. She didn't say anything. She just pulled her stick back. "Watch where you sit, alley rat," Billy said. He sneered. He looked around to make sure his friends were watching. They were. They snickered. Sam pushed off the wall. He didn't run. He walked, slow and deliberate. His jaw was set hard. "Move away from her, Billy," Sam said. His voice was completely steady, too steady for a 9-year-old boy. Billy turned. He looked Sam up and down. He saw the patched trousers, the oversized shirt, the worn-out boots. "Make me, beggar," Billy laughed. My pa says you two don't even belong in a real school. Says you belong in a workhouse. I don't care what your pa says, Sam said. He stopped 3 feet away. Step away from my sister. Billy's face turned ugly. The laugh disappeared. He leaned forward. She ain't a person, Billy spat, and neither are you. You're just a couple of bastards with no parents. Street trash, living off a widow's pity. Sam didn't think. He just moved. He didn't fight like a schoolboy. He didn't grab shirts or wrestle in the dirt. He fought like a boy who had survived on the streets. Sam threw a straight, hard punch. His small fist connected squarely with Billy's nose. There was a sharp crack. Billy stumbled back. Blood exploded down his lip. He screamed. He grabbed his face, falling backward into the dust. Sam didn't stop. He was on him in a second, pinning Billy down, drawing his fist back again. Sam, stop! Mr. Hadley, the schoolteacher, sprinted across the yard. He was a thin, nervous man. He grabbed Sam by the collar of his shirt and hauled him backward. Sam didn't thrash. He didn't scream. He just dropped his fist to his sides. He stood up, straight, breathing hard. His knuckles were scraped and bleeding. Billy was on the ground, wailing. Blood ruined his crisp, white shirt. Mr. Hadley looked from the bleeding boy to Sam. The teacher went pale. He knew who Billy's father was. He knew what Silas Vance could do to a man's livelihood. Inside, Mr. Hadley pointed a shaking finger at Sam. My desk. Half an hour later, the schoolhouse was empty of kids. Martha walked through the front door. She had practically run from her shop. Her fingers still had the red marks from pressing hard against a sewing needle. She walked up to the teacher's desk. Sam stood on the left side of the room, staring straight ahead. Billy sat in a chair on the right, holding a bloody rag to his nose, sniffling loudly. Mr. Hadley stood behind his desk. He looked miserable. Mrs. Higgins, Mr. Hadley said nervously. Thank you for coming. We have a very serious situation. Martha looked at Billy. Then she looked at Sam. She saw Sam's bleeding knuckles. Is he hurt? Martha asked. Billy has a broken nose. Mr. Hadley said quickly. I meant Samuel, Martha said. Her voice was ice. Mr. Hadley blinked. Samuel is the one who threw the punch, Mrs. Higgins, unprovoked, like a wild animal. Martha turned her body. She faced Sam. She walked over to him. She didn't yell. She didn't raise a hand. She just looked down into his dark, guarded eyes. Did you hit him, Sam? She asked quietly. Yes, ma'am, Sam said. He didn't flinch. Why? Sam swallowed hard. He looked over at Billy. He stepped on Clara's drawing. Then he called us bastards. Said we were street trash. Said we didn't have parents. Martha closed her eyes for a brief second. A muscle feathered in her jaw. She turned back to the teacher. Mr. Hadley, Martha said. Is this true? Did Billy Vance use that language toward my daughter? Mr. Hadley squirmed. Well, words were exchanged. Boys will be boys, Mrs. Higgins. But violence is unacceptable, especially against a boy from a prominent family. Samuel must apologize immediately, and he will face suspension. Martha stood perfectly still. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and heavy. No, Martha said. Mr. Hadley looked confused. I'm sorry? I said no, Martha repeated. Her voice carried to every corner of the empty room. Samuel will not apologize. Billy lowered the bloody rag. He stared at her, shocked. Mrs. Higgins, the teacher stammered. Mr. Vance will be furious. He could have Samuel thrown out of town. He could cause trouble for you. Let Silas Vance try, Martha said. She stood tall. Her spine was steel. My son defended his sister against a cruel, unwarranted attack. He defended her honor when no one else would. I do not condone fighting, Mr. Hadley, but I absolutely will not force a boy to apologize for protecting his family from a bully. If Billy wants an apology, he can give one first. To Clara. Mr. Hadley was speechless. Martha didn't wait for him to find his words. She turned to Sam. "Get your sister. We are going home." The walk back to the house was long. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. Clara held Martha's left hand. Sam walked on her right. He kept his distance, a full foot of space between him and Martha. He was waiting. He was waiting for the yelling, for the anger. He was waiting for her to say what everyone else always said, that he was too much trouble, that taking him in was a mistake, that she couldn't afford to make an enemy out of the richest man in town because of a stray orphan. But Martha didn't say a word. They reached the house. She unlocked the door. She poured water into a tin basin. She washed Sam's bleeding knuckles. She wrapped them in clean white cloth. Still, she didn't scold him. She made supper, cornbread and beans. They ate in silence. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. The time the sun went down, the tension inside Sam was a physical weight. It was crushing him. He couldn't stand the quiet. The quiet felt like a lie. It was 8 o'clock. Clara was asleep in the back room. The main room was dark, lit only by the low fire in the hearth. Martha sat in her rocking chair, a pile of mending in her lap, the rhythmic shh of the needle pulling through heavy canvas. Sam sat on a wooden stool by the fire. He stared into the orange flames. He had to tell her. He couldn't let her fight the whole town for a lie. She had called him her son today. She had called Clara his sister. She had stood up to the teacher for a family that wasn't even real, Mrs. Higgins. Sam's voice was small. It cracked in the quiet room. Martha stopped sewing. She rested her hands in her lap. She looked at him. "Yes, Sam." Sam didn't look away from the fire. He squeezed his hands together. His wrapped knuckles throbbed. "You shouldn't have done that today," Sam said. "At the school." "I did what was right," Martha said gently. "No." Sam shook his head. Fast, desperate. "You don't understand. Billy was right. We are trash. And I made you lie for me." Martha frowned. She set her mending aside. "I didn't lie, Samuel. You defended your sister. That is the truth." Sam squeezed his eyes shut. A single tear escaped. It cut a clean line down his dirt-smudged cheek. "She's not my sister," Sam whispered. The words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Martha didn't gasp. She didn't move. She just watched the boy shaking on the stool. "She's not my sister," Sam repeated, his voice breaking. He turned to look at Martha. His eyes were wide and filled with a terrifying vulnerability. "We don't share blood. My real pa, took me to the orphanage when I was 5. He couldn't feed me. He just left me there. Clara came 2 years later. A baby. Her mama died having her. Nobody knew who her father was." Sam wiped his face roughly with the back of his hand. "It was a bad place, Mrs. Higgins. The orphanage. It was cold. The big kids took the food. Clara was so little. She just cried all the time. Nobody picked her up. Nobody looked at her. She just sat in the dark corner and cried." Sam looked back at the fire, the flames reflected in his dark eyes. "I knew what that felt like," Sam said softly, "being in the dark. So one night I just crawled over to her cot. I sat next to her. I took her hand. I told her I was her big brother now, and that nobody was ever going to hurt her again." He looked down at his bandaged hands. "I've lied to everyone. We're not a real family. We're just 2 kids who didn't have anyone else. You stood up for us today. You put your own house in danger with Mr. Vance, and it was all for a lie. We're not a family." He waited. He waited for her to point to the door. He waited for the disappointment. He heard the rocking chair creak. Martha stood up. She walked slowly across the wooden floorboards. She stopped right in front of him. Sam kept his head down, preparing for the worst. Then he felt her hands, warm and gentle. She reached out and took his face in both of her hands. She lifted his head until he was forced to look right into her deep green eyes. Martha wasn't angry. Her eyes were shining with tears. She didn't just touch his face. She pulled him forward. She wrapped her arms around him. She pulled his head against her chest and held him tight. Sam froze. He hadn't been hugged like this. Not ever. He didn't know what to do with his arms. "Samuel," Martha whispered into his hair. She pulled back just enough to look at him. She made sure he saw the absolute certainty in her face. She needed him to hear this. She needed to carve these words into his heart so deeply that no bully, no banker, and no cruel world could ever erase them. "Listen to me, Sam," Martha said, her voice clear, strong, and unwavering. "Bloodlines are dictated by nature. They are an accident of birth. But love is humanity's greatest choice. From the exact moment you crawled across that dark floor and held that little girl's hand to protect her, you became her true brother." Sam stared at her. His chest heaved. He was trying so hard not to cry. Martha smoothed the hair back from his forehead. "Families are forged by love, Sam," Martha stated clearly, emphasizing every single word. "They are not built by birth certificates or matching blood. They are built by the people who choose to stand in the dark with you. You chose her. You protected her. That makes you more of a brother than any blood ever could." The dam finally broke. Sam let out a ragged sob. He threw his arms around Martha's waist. He buried his face in her apron. He cried. He cried for the father who left him. He cried for the cold nights in the orphanage. He cried for the sheer, overwhelming relief of finally being seen, of finally being safe. Martha held him. She rocked him slowly, side to side. "You are a family," Martha whispered softly into the quiet room. "And you are my son. Nobody in this town will ever tell you otherwise. Do you understand me?" Sam nodded against her chest. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." They stayed like that for a long time. The fire cracked and popped in the heart. The shadows danced on the walls. Outside, the wind howled across the desolate Texas plains. It was a cold, unforgiving world out there. A world ruled by men like Silas Vance, who believed that money and blood were the only things of value. But inside the small wooden house, a different kind of wealth was being forged, stronger than gold, deeper than blood. The truth was out. The fracture was healed. Sam finally knew what it felt like to have a home. Not just a roof, not just a warm meal, but a place where he didn't have to fight to be worthy. He was chosen. And for the first time in his 9 years of life, that was more than enough. Tuesday came with a heavy sky. Clouds like bruised iron rolled over Red Rock. No rain, just the threat of it. The air was thick, hard to breathe. It felt like the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for the sky to break. Silas Vance didn't wait for the rain. He made his own storm. He walked into the sheriff's office at 10 in the morning. His boots clicked sharp and clean on the floorboards. Sheriff John Hayes looked up from his desk. Hayes was an older man. Tired eyes, a gray mustache stained yellow from tobacco. He kept the peace because mostly Red Rock was too hot for real trouble. Until today. Silas dropped a thick manila folder on the sheriff's desk. It hit with a heavy slap. "What's this, Silas?" Hayes asked. "Justice," Silas said smoothly. He tapped the folder with his silver-tipped cane. "A warrant from a federal judge in Dallas, sent down by courier this morning." Hayes opened the folder. He read the top page. He frowned. He read it again. The color drained from his weathered face. "Arthur Pendleton?" Hayes said. He looked up, confused. "This says murder. Abilene, Kansas, 1870. "A man named James Carver," Silas nodded. He looked very pleased with himself. "Stabbed in the back during a dispute over cattle lines." Pendleton fled the territory, changed his life, hid out right here in our town, pretending to be a respectable rancher. Hayes shook his head. Arthur ain't a killer, Silas. I've known him 5 years. He don't even wear a gun in town. People hide their true nature, John. Silas leaned over the desk. The smile vanished from his face. The warrant is signed. The affidavits are sworn. I have 2 witnesses from Dallas who will swear under oath they saw Pendleton do it. You have your orders. Arrest him. Hayes looked at the paper. It was legal. It had the seals. He didn't like it. He didn't believe it. But a badge meant following the paper. I'll ride out, Hayes said quietly. See that you do, Silas said. He turned and walked out. An hour later, the dust settled in the yard of the Pendleton ranch. Arthur was in the barn. He was fixing a broken leather trace. The smell of oil and old leather filled the cool, dark space. He heard the horses approaching, 2 riders. He set the leather down. He walked to the wide barn doors. Sheriff Hayes sat on his horse. A deputy sat next to him. Neither man looked happy. Neither man had their hand on their gun. Morning, John, Arthur said. His voice was calm. Arthur, Hayes nodded. He looked down at the pommel of his saddle. He took a deep breath. I got a piece of paper in my saddlebag. It's a bad piece of paper. Arthur didn't move. Read it. Hayes pulled the warrant. He cleared his throat. He read the charges. Murder in the 1st degree. James Carver. Abilene, 1870. Arthur listened. His face didn't change. Not a muscle twitched. He knew the name James Carver. Carver was the man who had stabbed him in the alley. The man who left him to bleed to death in the mud before William Barrett found him. Carver was dead, but Arthur hadn't killed him. A horse had kicked Carver in the chest 2 days later in a drunken brawl. Silas Vance gave you this? Arthur asked. Hayes looked surprised. Yes, Federal Courier brought it to the bank. Arthur understood immediately. It was a frame-up, clean, expensive. Silas had hired men to lie. He was using the law as a weapon to clear Arthur off the land. Without Arthur, the ranch would go to auction. Silas would buy it for pennies. Arthur, Hayes said gently, I have to take you in. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry for doing your job, John, Arthur said. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He turned around, walked into the barn, grabbed his coat, and walked back out. He held his wrists together. No need for cuffs, Arthur, Hayes sighed. Just ride with us. They rode into town right at noon. The main street was crowded. People stopped. They stared. Arthur Pendleton, the quiet rancher, the man who just bought the saloon to feed the orphans, was riding between the sheriff and a deputy, heading for the jail. Whispers started. They spread like a brush fire. Martha was in her shop. She was fitting a dress for the baker's wife. Bea threw the front door open. The little bell rang violently. Bea was breathing hard. Her face was flushed. Martha, drop the pins. Martha looked up. Bae, what is it? It's Arthur. Hayes just locked him up. Martha dropped the pins. They scattered on the wooden floor. For what? Murder, Bea said. She spat the word out like it tasted sour. Some old charge from Kansas. Silas Vance is behind it. He's parading around the street right now, telling everyone Arthur is a cold-blooded killer. Martha didn't say a word. She took off her sewing apron. She threw it over a chair. She walked past Bea, out the door, and into the blistering heat of the street. She didn't go to the jail. Not yet. She walked straight to the Red Rock Bank. She pushed through the heavy glass doors. The tellers stopped counting. The guards looked up. Martha didn't look at them. She walked straight to the back office. She didn't knock. She turned the brass knob and pushed the door wide open. Silas Vance was sitting at his mahogany desk. He was pouring a glass of amber whiskey. Celebrating. He looked up. He smiled. Mrs. Higgins, Silas said. To what do I owe this pleasure? Have you brought the $400? You have until Friday, remember. Martha stepped into the room. She closed the door behind her. You framed him, Martha said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, low, even. Silas took a sip of his whiskey. I have no idea what you mean. The law caught up with a dangerous fugitive. We should all feel safer. You couldn't bully him, Martha said, stepping closer to the desk. You couldn't buy him out. So you bought a judge in Dallas. You bought fake witnesses. You want his land. That is a severe accusation, Silas said. His eyes went hard, and impossible to prove. The man is going to hang, Mrs. Higgins. It's a tragedy, but it opens up an opportunity for you. Martha didn't blink. I don't make deals with snakes. You'll make this one, Silas said. He leaned back in his leather chair. He steepled his fingers. Your debt is due on Friday. You can't pay it. I will take your house. I will put you and those two stray children on the street. Unless. He let the word hang in the quiet office. Unless what? Martha asked. Unless you help the town see the truth about Mr. Pendleton, Silas said smoothly. Arthur has a reputation now as a savior, buying that saloon, feeding those kids. It makes him look sympathetic. Juries like hanging sympathetic men. Silas leaned forward. Your boy, Samuel. He viciously attacked my son yesterday. Broke his nose, a violent, unprovoked attack. Suppose you were to tell the sheriff that Arthur Pendleton taught your boy to do that? Suppose you tell the town that Arthur is a violent man, a bad influence, that he threatened you. If you paint him as a monster, I will tear up the deed to your house. Your debt will be forgiven. Completely. Martha looked at the man sitting behind the desk. She saw the tailored suit, the gold watch, the polished shoes. She saw all the wealth in the world, and she saw absolutely nothing of value. Martha leaned over the desk. She placed her small, calloused hands flat on the polished mahogany. She brought her face inches from Silas S. Silas Vance, Martha said. Her voice was a fierce, steady whisper. I would rather sleep in the dirt. I would rather starve in the alley. I would rather walk out of this town with nothing but the clothes on my back than ever speak a single lie against a decent man. Silas's smug smile vanished. His face twisted with sudden, ugly rage. You're a fool, Silas hissed. He's a dead man. And come Friday, you are a homeless beggar. Then I'll be a beggar with a clean conscience, Martha said. She stood up straight. She turned her back on the most powerful man in Red Rock. She opened the door and walked out, leaving Silas Vance sitting alone with his whiskey. The jailhouse smelled of rust and stale sweat. It was a small stone building at the end of the street. Inside, there were 3 iron cells. 2 were empty. Arthur sat in the third. He sat on the narrow cot. His hands rested on his knees. He was staring at the stone wall opposite him. He wasn't afraid. He was just tired. The world was a crooked place. He had tried to hide from it. Then he had tried to help fix a small corner of it, and this was the reward. A small sound came from the barred window high up on the back wall, a scraping sound, like a boot on stone. Arthur looked up. A small face appeared between the iron bars. Sam. The boy had climbed the rain barrel in the alley to reach the window.
Mr. Pendleton,
Sam whispered into the dark cell. Arthur stood up. He walked to the wall. He looked up at the boy. You shouldn't be here, Sam, Arthur said gently. If the sheriff catches you, he'll run you off. I don't care about the sheriff, Sam said. His knuckles were still wrapped in white cloth. He gripped the iron bars tight. Martha told me what happened. She said, Mr. Vance put you in here. He did, Arthur said. They say you killed a man? Sam's voice wavered. Just a little. A long time ago. They say they have papers proving it. Arthur looked at the 9-year-old boy. The boy who had spent his whole life being being let down by adults, being lied to, being abandoned. They have papers, Sam, Arthur said quietly. But the papers are a lie. I never killed that man. Sam didn't ask for details. He didn't need a long explanation. He just looked at Arthur's face. He looked at the eyes of the man who had taught him how to calm a frightened horse. I know, Sam said. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest. You believe me? Papers lie, Sam said fiercely. Good men don't. You're a good man, you're my... Sam stopped. He swallowed hard. You're my friend. We ain't going to let him do this to you. Go home, Sam, Arthur said. His voice was thick. Go be with Martha and your sister. Sam nodded. His face disappeared from the window. Arthur stepped back from the wall. He sat back down on the cot. He lowered his head into his hands. For the first time since they locked the iron door, he felt a tear burn the corner of his eye. Outside, the town was gathering. The heat of the day was breaking. Evening was coming. A crowd had formed in the street between the bank and the jailhouse. 50 people. Then 100. Silas Vance stood on the wooden boardwalk in front of the bank. He was speaking loudly, whipping the crowd up. We welcomed a viper into our town, Silas shouted. He pointed his cane toward the jail. A murderer hiding in plain sight. Red Rock is a town of law and order. We cannot let men like Arthur Pendleton use their money to blind us to their crimes. The crowd murmured. People were confused. Some were angry. Arthur had always been quiet, kept to himself. Maybe it was true. Maybe he was hiding. Martha pushed her way through the crowd. She held Sam with one hand and Clara with the other. She stood near the front. She glared at Silas. Silas saw her. He smiled a cold, vicious smile. He opened his mouth to speak again, to point at the orphans, to use them against Arthur just like he had threatened in his office. But a heavy wooden cane struck the boardwalk. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Reverend Josiah Miller stepped out of the church at the end of the street. He was 60 years old, tall, thin as a rail. He wore a black suit that was faded at the elbows. He walked with a limp, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. But when he stopped in the center of the street, between the crowd and Silas Vance, he looked like a giant. The town fell silent. Everyone respected the Reverend. He had baptized their babies. He had buried their dead. Josiah looked at Silas. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly disappointed. Silas Vance, the Reverend's voice boomed. It didn't need shouting. It carried on the wind, deep and resonant. Silas tightened his grip on his silver cane. Reverend, you should go back inside. This is a matter of federal law. It doesn't concern the church. It concerns the soul of this town, Josiah countered. He turned his back on Silas. He faced the crowd. He faced the people of Red Rock. He planted his cane firmly in the dirt. He looked from face to face. He saw Martha. He saw the children. Listen to me, all of you, Josiah called out, making sure his words reached the very back of the crowd. We are standing on the edge of a terrible mistake. You look at pieces of paper signed in a city far away, and you let a banker tell you they are the absolute truth. Josiah raised his free hand. He pointed it high into the air. Let me tell you the truth, Josiah said, his voice ringing with absolute, explicit clarity. Laws made by men can be manipulated by the wealthy. They can be bought with gold. They can be twisted to serve greed. But the justice of conscience always demands the truth, and the truth is not found in forged documents. The crowd was completely silent. Silas looked nervous. He took a step forward. Reverend, you are interfering with... I am interfering with wickedness, Josiah roared, cutting Silas off instantly. Josiah turned his piercing gaze back to the crowd. He spoke the lesson clearly, refusing to hide behind metaphors. Arthur Pendleton is an innocent man. He is a man who fed the starving when the rest of us looked away. Imprisoning an innocent man to steal his land is a crime against the sacred rights of humanity. It is a violation of human dignity. If we allow Silas Vance to use the law as a weapon to destroy a good man for profit, then we are no longer a town of decent people. We become accomplices to tyranny. Josiah lowered his hand. He looked straight at Martha. He offered her a small respectful nod. Then he looked back at the town. I know the truth about Arthur Pendleton, Josiah said quietly. And tomorrow morning, when the circuit judge arrives, I will swear it on the Holy Bible. I suggest you all go home and look long and hard in your mirrors tonight. Ask yourselves what kind of town you want to live in. Josiah didn't wait for a response. He turned. He walked slowly, leaning on his cane, straight toward the jailhouse. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They just slowly began to drift apart. Heads bowed, thinking. Silas Vance stood alone on the boardwalk. His face was pale. His hands were shaking with fury. His perfect plan was cracking. Martha watched the Reverend enter the jailhouse. She squeezed Sam's hand. Come on, Martha whispered. Let's go home. Tomorrow is going to be a big day. For the first time since the morning, Martha smiled. It was a fierce, hopeful smile. The storm hadn't broken them. It had just washed away the lies. The circuit judge rode into Red Rock on a Wednesday morning. He looked tired. He looked dusty. He didn't look like a man who took kindly to having his time wasted. He sat in his makeshift courtroom inside the saloon. It was the only room big enough to hold the crowd. Arthur sat at a wooden table, his hands folded, calm. Vance sat across the aisle. He had his two hired witnesses from Dallas, two men in cheap suits, sweating through their collars. The judge banged a wooden gavel. The room went dead quiet. Let's hear it, the judge grumbled. Silas stood up. He pointed at Arthur. He talked about murder. He talked about justice. He talked for 10 minutes. Then he put his Dallas men on the stand. They told a good story. Smooth. Rehearsed. They said they saw Arthur stab James Carver in an alley in Abilene 8 years ago. The judge looked at Arthur. You got a defense, Mr. Pendleton. Arthur didn't stand. He just looked toward the back of the room. Reverend Josiah Miller stood up. He walked down the center aisle. He leaned on his wooden cane. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Josiah reached the front. He handed the judge a leather-bound journal. I buried James Pace Carver, Your Honor, Josiah said. His voice was a deep, rolling thunder. I was a preacher in Abilene in 1870. I signed the death certificate. Carver wasn't stabbed. He was kicked in the chest by a roan stallion outside a tavern, crushed his ribs. I sat with him while he died. The judge opened the journal. He looked at the old, faded ink. These men, Josiah pointed his cane at the sweating Dallas witnesses, are committing perjury. I've never seen them in Abilene. And if you send a wire to the Abilene marshal right now, he will confirm everything I just said. The judge looked at the Dallas men. They shrank in their chairs. They didn't look like confident witnesses anymore. They looked like men who suddenly realized the price of a lie. The judge slammed his gavel down hard. Case dismissed, the judge barked. He glared at Silas. Mr. Vance, you're treading on thin ice. Bring me papers again, and I'll have you in irons. The crowd erupted. Cheers. Shouts. The heavy tension in the room shattered like glass. Arthur stood up. He didn't gloat. He didn't look at Silas. He just walked out the swinging doors. Stepping out onto the porch, the sunlight hit him. It felt warm. It felt like freedom. Martha was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Sam and Clara were right beside her. Sam didn't say a word. He just stood tall, brought his right hand up to his forehead, and gave Arthur a sharp, perfect salute, like a soldier greeting his captain. Arthur stopped. A slow, genuine smile broke across his weathered face. He returned the salute. Clara broke rank. She ran up the wooden steps. She threw her arms around Arthur's knees. She hugged him tight. Arthur reached down. He placed a heavy, gentle hand on her head. He looked up at Martha. Her eyes were bright. She was smiling. "You're out," Martha said softly. "I'm out," Arthur agreed. "Arthur." The voice came from behind him. Reverend Josiah stood in the saloon doorway. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp. "Walk with me to the church," Josiah said. "Martha, bring the children. It's time." The church was quiet. It smelled of old pine and melted wax. Josiah lit a single lantern on the front altar. He sat down in the front pew. He motioned for Arthur and Martha to sit across from him. Sam and Clara sat 2 rows back, tracing the grain of the wood with their fingers. Josiah leaned on his cane. He looked at Arthur. 7 years ago, William Barrett pulled you out of the mud in Kansas, Josiah said. He did, Arthur said. He saved my life. You told me that story when you first moved here. Josiah nodded. You told me the man's name, but Arthur, there's something you never knew. Something William never knew either. Arthur frowned. What? William had a sister, Josiah said softly. They got separated when they were young, shipped off to different relatives back east, lost track of each other entirely. Martha sat perfectly still. She could feel the air in the room, shifting, changing shape. The sister came out west, Josiah continued. She settled right here in Texas. She met a rancher. She fell in love, and she married him. Josiah reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, faded photograph. He handed it to Arthur. Arthur took it. His hands started to shake. It was a picture of his wife, Eleanor, taken before she got sick. She was smiling. Eleanor's maiden name, Josiah said quietly, was Barrett. Arthur stopped breathing. The church went dead silent. He stared at the photograph. He looked up at Josiah. Then he turned his head slowly. He looked at the little girl sitting 2 rows back, Clara, with her quiet eyes, with her soft brown hair. William was her brother, Arthur whispered. His voice was completely hollowed out. Yes, Josiah said. William Barrett was Eleanor's older brother. Clara and Sam. Arthur, Clara is your niece, by marriage, but by blood to the wife you loved. Arthur dropped his head into his hands. The weight of it, the sheer staggering weight of it crashed down on him like a falling sky. He had bought a saloon to feed a starving girl in an alley. He had done it out of a debt of honor. He had no idea he was saving his own family. He had no idea he was looking at the last living piece of his wife's bloodline. Martha reached out. She put her hand on Arthur's back. She didn't say anything. She just let him feel the warmth of her hand, letting him know he wasn't alone in the dark. William came looking for her, Josiah said softly. He came to this town a year after Eleanor passed. He found me. I had to tell him his sister was in the ground. He wept right where you're sitting. He told me he was headed to Kansas. A few months later, he found you in an alley, and he saved you. Josiah smiled a sad, beautiful smile. God weaves a strange and perfect tapestry, Arthur. We just only ever get to see the loose threads. An hour later, the children were waiting by the church doors with the Reverend. Arthur and Martha stood outside, under the vast, star-filled Texas sky. The night air was cool. Arthur looked out the dark horizon. He felt entirely different. The rock on his chest, the heavy, suffocating rock he had carried for 7 years. It was gone. He turned to Martha. He reached out and took both of her hands in his. His grip was strong, calloused, warm. He looked straight into her eyes. He needed her to understand the lesson the universe had just handed him. He needed to say it out loud. "I thought everything was gone," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought when Eleanor died, the whole world just stopped making sense. But look at this, Martha. Look at what happened." He squeezed her hands. "A single act of genuine kindness can save generations," Arthur said. The words rang clear and absolute in the quiet night. "You hear me? It echoes. Their father saved my life when he had no reason to, and because he did, I was alive to be here. I have the chance to save his children. Compassion is never wasted, Martha. It travels through time. It waits in the shadows, and it always, always finds its way back to where it belongs." Martha looked up at him. Tears shimmered in her green eyes. She didn't pull her hands away. She held on tighter. "It brought them to you," Martha whispered. "No," Arthur corrected her softly. "It brought them to us." They stood together under the stars. The silent rancher and the widow with the spine of steel. They weren't broken anymore. They were just the pieces of a new foundation. Silas Vance was a man who hated to lose. If he couldn't use the law to hang Arthur Pendleton, he would use it to break Martha Higgins. He would hit them where it hurt the most. It was Friday morning. Martha was in her kitchen. She was boiling water for oats. A heavy knock rattled the front door. Martha wiped her hands on her apron. She opened the door. It wasn't Silas. It was the county clerk, a nervous little man holding a thick stack of legal papers. "Mrs. Higgins," the clerk mumbled. He wouldn't look her in the eye. He shoved the papers into her hands. "Summons for county court tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Martha looked at the top page. The bold ink jumped out at her. Motion to strip custody. Plaintiff: Red Rock Bank and Trust. Defendant: Martha Abigail Higgins. Custody? Martha breathed. Her heart skipped a hard beat. "Mr. Vance filed the petition," the clerk said quickly, backing away. "Citing severe financial insolvency. He says you have no legal standing to house the orphans. Says you're unfit to provide a moral or stable environment. The state will take the children tomorrow and put them in the county asylum." The clerk turned and practically ran down the street. Martha stood in the doorway. The paper felt like burning iron in her hands. Unfit. They were going to take Sam. They were going to take Clara. They were going to throw them back into the cold, dark world they had just barely survived. Panic rose in Martha's throat, hot and sharp. She slammed the door shut. She leaned against the wood. She closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe. She couldn't panic. If she panicked, Silas won. She needed money. She needed proof she could provide. She ran to her bedroom. She pulled her late husband's heavy iron lock box from under the bed. It was covered in dust. She hadn't opened it since Thomas died. It held old mining deeds. Worthless paper. But maybe there was something. A hidden bond. A forgotten claim. She snapped the lock open. She dug through the papers, frantic, throwing aside land surveys and old receipts. Nothing. Nothing of value. She hit the bottom of the box. Her fingers brushed against thick parchment. It was an envelope, sealed with red wax. Martha pulled it out. The handwriting on the front was Thomas S. bold and sloping. For Martha, when the night is darkest. Martha's breath hitched in her chest. She stared at the handwriting. It was like hearing a ghost whisper in her ear. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. She unfolded the heavy paper. The date at the top was 2 days before the mine collapsed. She began to read. "My dearest Martha, if you are reading this, I am gone, and I have left you with burdens a good man should never leave his wife. The mine is failing. The debt is too high. I know I am running out of time. I'm so sorry, my love. You deserved a better life than the one I gave you. But I need you to know something. A week ago, I sat with Reverend Josiah. I was looking for peace. He told me a secret. He told me about the two little orphans sleeping behind the saloon. He told me the little girl is blood kin to Arthur Pendleton's late wife. I wanted to help them. I wanted to do one good thing before my luck ran out, but I don't have the means. You do. Martha stopped reading. She wiped a tear from her cheek. She read the next paragraph. You have the strongest heart I have ever known, Martha. You are a mother without children. They are children without a mother. Find them. Take them in. And when things get too hard, when the town turns against you, find Arthur Pendleton. Tell him the truth. I know he is a closed-off man, but I believe he will help you. You will need each other. Martha traced her husband's signature with a trembling finger. Then she read the final lines at the bottom of the page. The ink was pressed hard into the paper. Thomas wanted these words to last. Do not let anyone tell you those children are a mistake, Martha. Do not let the bankers or the politicians tell you they are worthless. Read my words and remember them when you stand in front of the judge. Society often calls orphans a burden. They say, it is a waste of money to feed children who belong to no one. But in truth, they are a test of our humanity. Caring for them is not charity. It is the fundamental duty of every adult. If a town cannot protect its most vulnerable children, it has lost its right to call itself civilized. Fight for them, Martha. I will be watching from the stars. I love you, Thomas. Martha lowered the letter. She sat on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by old papers. She wasn't crying from panic anymore. She was crying from a profound, overwhelming sense of clarity. Thomas had known. He had steered her toward this. Even from the grave, her husband had believed in her strength. He had believed in her right to be a mother. She folded the letter carefully. She placed it inside her dress right over her heart. She stood up. Her spine was steel again. Silas Vance wanted a fight in a courtroom. She was going to give him a war. Across town, Arthur was already moving. He had heard the news from Bea. He didn't ride out to the ranch. He didn't hire a fancy lawyer from Dallas. Arthur Pendleton walked down the main street of Red Rock. He carried a clipboard and a fountain pen. He knocked on the door of the bakery. The baker opened it. Sign this, Arthur said. His voice left no room for argument. What is it, Arthur? The baker asked. It's a declaration of character, Arthur said. Swearing that Martha Higgins is a fit and proper mother. Swearing that this town supports her right to raise Sam and Clara. The baker looked at the quiet rancher. He looked at the fierce determination in Arthur's eyes. The baker took the pen. He signed. Arthur went to the blacksmith. He went to the feed store. He went to the livery stable. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just looked every man and woman in the eye. Silas Vance is trying to take two children from a good mother to settle a grudge, Arthur told them. You want to live in a town that lets a bank steal children? Sign the paper. They signed. The blacksmith signed. The school teacher signed. The women from the church signed. By sunset, Arthur had walked the entire length of Red Rock. His boots were covered in dust. His hand was cramped from holding the clipboard. He walked up to Martha's front porch. He knocked. Martha opened the door. She looked tired, but she looked fierce, like a lioness standing in the mouth of a cave. Arthur held out the clipboard. 34 signatures, Arthur said quietly. The doctor, the reverend, the sheriff, half the town. Martha looked at the pages filled with ink. She looked up at Arthur. Why are you doing all this, Arthur? Martha asked softly. You bought the saloon. You got out of jail. You could just take Clara. She's your family. You could take her to the ranch and leave me to fight my own battles. Arthur took his hat off. He's closer to her. Clara is my family, Arthur said. But so is Sam, and so are you. Martha's breath caught. I'm not leaving you to fight alone, Martha, Arthur said. Not tomorrow. Not ever again. He didn't ask to come in. He just tipped his hat, turned around, and walked back down the steps. Standing guard in the town, making sure Silas Vance didn't try anything in the dark. Martha stood in the doorway. She touched the letter hidden over her heart. She looked at the clipboard in her hand. The night was dark. But for the first time in her life, Martha Higgins wasn't afraid of the morning. The county courthouse smelled of the lemon polish and old tension. It was Saturday morning. 9 o'clock. The room was packed. Standing room only in the back. Every face in Red Rock was there, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Silas Vance sat at the plaintiff's table. He wore a brand new suit. He had a lawyer from Dallas sitting next to him, a man with slick hair and a leather briefcase. Martha sat at the defense table. She wore her best gray dress. She sat perfectly straight. Sam sat on her right, his jaw tight. Clara sat on her left, holding Martha's hand under the table. Arthur Pendleton sat in the first row, right behind them. He didn't have a lawyer. He just had the clipboard. The heavy oak doors at the front opened. Judge Harrison walked in. He was an older man, famous in the circuit for not taking any nonsense from anybody. He climbed the steps to the bench and sat down. He didn't bang a gavel. He just looked out at the crowded room. Let's get this over with, Judge Harrison grumbled. Motion to custody. Plaintiff claims the defendant is financially and morally unfit. The Dallas lawyer stood up. He adjusted his silk tie. Your Honor, the lawyer began, his voice practiced and smooth. This is a simple matter of economics and stability. Mrs. Higgins is a widow. She operates a failing sewing business out of a house she no longer owns. She is in default to the Red Rock Bank. She has no means to support herself, let alone 2 feral children she pulled from an alley. The lawyer walked back and forth in front of the judge's bench. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, these children have no legal guardian. They are wards of the state. Leaving them in the care of an impoverished, desperate woman is a disservice to the children and a burden on the town. Mr. Vance, as a pillar of the community, is simply acting in the best interest of the state by asking the court to remand them to the county orphanage. The lawyer sat down. He looked very pleased with himself. Silas Vance smiled a thin, confident smile. Judge Harrison looked over his spectacles at Martha. Mrs. Higgins, you have no counsel. Do you wish to speak for yourself? Martha stood up. She didn't have a slick suit. She didn't have a leather briefcase. She just had the absolute, undeniable truth. I do, Your Honor, Martha said. Her voice carried clearly to the back of the room. She reached into her dress and pulled out the letter from Thomas. She laid it on the table. The plaintiff's lawyer speaks of economics. Martha began. He speaks of ledgers and debts. But I am not here to argue numbers. I am here to argue what makes a family. She picked up the clipboard Arthur had given her. She handed it up to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. I have 34 signatures from the citizens of Red Rock, Martha said. The doctor, the school teacher, the reverend, they all swear that my home is safe, that my children are loved. She turned slightly, pointing to the letter on the table. Before my husband died, he wrote that letter, Martha said, her voice steady and strong. He told me to take these children in. He told me exactly what I need this court to hear today. Martha looked directly at the judge. She spoke the words clearly, making sure the educational value of her fight was undeniable. Your Honor, society often calls orphans a burden. They say it is a waste of money to feed children who belong to no one. But caring for them is not charity. It is the fundamental duty of every adult. If a town or a court cannot protect its most vulnerable children, it has lost its right to call itself civilized. My children are not feral. They are not a burden. They are my family. Martha remained standing. The Dallas lawyer scoffed. He stood back up. Sentimental nonsense, Your Honor, the lawyer sneered. 34 signatures do not pay a mortgage. Good intentions do not put food on the table. The fact remains, Mrs. Higgins is bankrupt. She is homeless as of yesterday. A child cannot eat love. The lawyer pointed a sharp finger at Martha. You cannot grant custody to a woman who cannot provide basic financial security. Wealth is the only guarantee of a stable environment. The courtroom murmured. The Dallas lawyer had a point. The law was the law. You had to prove you could provide. Judge Harrison looked down at the paperwork. He sighed. He didn't want to do it, but the law was clear. Mrs. Higgins, the judge said softly, I appreciate your passion. I read the signatures, but the plaintiff's counsel is correct. If you cannot demonstrate financial solvency, the state cannot, in good conscience, leave the children in your care. Silas Vance leaned back in his chair. He had won. He had broken her. Martha felt the floor drop out from under her. She looked down at Sam and Clara. Sam was glaring at Silas. Clara was crying silently. Excuse me, Your Honor. The voice came from the first row. Deep, gravelly, absolute.
Arthur Pendleton stood up. He didn't ask permission. He walked through the wooden gate and stood right beside Martha.
Mr. Pendleton, the judge said, raising an eyebrow, you are not a party to this case. I am now, Arthur said. He reached inside his heavy coat. He pulled out a folded document. He didn't hand it to the bailiff. He walked right up to the bench and handed it directly to Judge Harrison. What is this? The judge asked. That is the deed to Mrs. Higgins' house, Arthur said loudly, making sure Silas heard every word. And the note on her debt, paid in full, yesterday afternoon. Silas Vance shot out of his chair. His face was purple. That's a lie. She owes my bank. Your bank is currently under federal audit, Silas, Arthur said, turning to face the banker. The marshals arrived an hour ago. While you were sitting in here, they locked your doors. They're investigating you for predatory lending and fraud. The state took over your assets this morning. I bought Martha's debt from the state for cash. The courtroom exploded. Shouts. Gasps. Silas Vance looked like he had been struck by lightning. He turned to his Dallas lawyer. The lawyer was already packing his briefcase, trying to look invisible. Arthur turned back to the judge. Mrs. Higgins owns her house free and clear, Arthur stated. And if the court requires further financial guarantee for the children, I am officially entering my name as co-guardian. The Pendleton Ranch stands behind them, both of them. Arthur looked at the judge. He didn't speak in metaphors. He laid the moral lesson bare for the entire room to hear. Your Honor, Arthur said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. Wealth does not guarantee a righteous soul, and poverty does not make a person unfit to love. A child's right to love, to protection, and to dignity supersedes any financial ledger. Mrs. Higgins has given these children her heart. I am giving them my name. The law should not tear a family apart just because a banker wants to settle a score. Judge Harrison looked at the deed. He looked at Silas Vance, who was currently being questioned quietly by the town sheriff in the corner. Then the judge looked at Martha, Arthur, and the two children sitting between them. The judge picked up his wooden gavel. He didn't tap it. He brought it down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. The court has heard enough, Judge Harrison declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Wealth does not dictate a person's worth, and it certainly does not dictate their capacity to love. The motion to strip custody is denied. This formally recognizes Martha Abigail Higgins and Arthur Pendleton as the legal guardians of Samuel and Clara. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Real, deafening cheers. Martha collapsed into her chair. She buried her face in her hands. She was crying, happy, overwhelming tears. Sam threw his arms around her neck. Clara hugged her waist. Arthur stood beside them. He didn't cheer. He just placed a heavy, warm hand on Martha's shoulder. 2 hours later, the dust had settled. Silas Vance was in custody, waiting for the federal marshals to finish their audit. The town of Red Rock felt lighter, like a dark cloud had finally blown past. Arthur and Martha walked up the steps to Martha's house. Sam and Clara were already inside, packing their few belongings into burlap sacks. They were moving out to the ranch. Arthur stood on the porch. He looked out over the dusty street. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out the deed to the house. He held it out to Martha. "Here," Arthur said. Martha took it. She looked at the paper. Then she looked at Arthur. "I can't pay you back," Martha said softly, "not for a long time." Arthur didn't say anything. He reached out, took the paper from her hands, and tore it cleanly in half. Then he tore it again. He let the pieces fall onto the porch. The wind caught them, scattering them into the dirt. Martha gasped. "Arthur, what did you do?" "You don't owe me anything, Martha," Arthur said. He stepped closer to her. The afternoon sun caught the silver in his hair. "I didn't buy the debt to hold it over you. I bought it so nobody else ever could." He took off his hat. He held it in his hands. He looked nervous. The silent, stoic rancher, who had stared down a corrupt banker and a federal judge, was suddenly struggling to find his words. "I'm not a man who talks much, Martha," Arthur said, his voice dropping low. "You know that. I'm stubborn. I got a big, empty house out there on the plains. It gets cold in the winter. It gets lonely." He looked into her deep green eyes. "But it doesn't have to be empty anymore," Arthur said. "I don't want to just be their co-guardian on a piece of court paper. I want to be their father, and I want to be your husband, if you'll have me." He didn't offer a ring. He didn't offer flowery promises. He offered the only thing he had left, the absolute, unbroken truth. "I locked the door to my heart 7 years ago, Martha," Arthur whispered. "You and those kids broke it down. I'm asking you to never let me lock it again." Martha looked at him. She saw the lines of grief on his face, but she also saw the immense, quiet strength underneath it. She reached out. She traced the line of his jaw with her hand. "Arthur Pendleton." Martha smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "You couldn't get rid of us now if you tried." She leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a sudden, fiery spark. It was the deep, steady warmth of a hearth fire, finally catching light after a long, cold winter. Spring came to Texas in a wash of green and gold. The wedding was held in the yard of the Pendleton Ranch, under the massive oak tree where Clara liked to draw. The whole town came. Bea Gallagher brought 3 kegs of cider. Reverend Josiah performed the ceremony. Martha wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself. Arthur wore a clean black suit. He looked younger. The heavy rock was truly gone from his chest. When it came time for the bride to be given away, Sam didn't hesitate. He wore a new shirt. He stepped forward, holding Martha's right hand. Clara held her left. Sam looked up at Arthur. He gave the rancher that same sharp soldier's salute. Arthur returned it. Sam placed Martha's hand in Arthur's. Years later, when Clara was grown and people asked her about her childhood, she would tell them the story of the saloon. She would tell them about the dusty alley, about the hunger, and then she would tell them the real truth about kindness. "True kindness," Clara would say, her voice echoing the lessons she learned under the Texas sky, isn't tossing a coin to a beggar. True kindness is smashing the back door to pieces so they can walk through the front with their heads held high. My father didn't just buy a saloon to feed us. He bought it to remind the world that dignity isn't something you can buy or sell. It is something you are born with. The story of the silent rancher and the widow with the spine of steel became a legend in Red Rock. Not a legend of gunfights or gold rushes, but a legend of a quiet man who proved that sometimes the loudest thing you can do is simply refuse to let the darkness win.
As the sun sets over the vast plains of Red Rock, the dust settles, and the town grows quiet once more. We are left to reflect on what truly matters. This story is not just about a boy and a girl struggling to survive, or a rancher whose past carries heavy shadows. It is about the invisible threads that connect us all. We see that courage is not only drawn from strength of arms, but from the courage to act with compassion in a world that often rewards selfishness. We learn that family is not defined by blood alone, but by those who choose to stand by one another, who protect the vulnerable, and who refuse to let cruelty go unchallenged. The sacrifices and choices of Arthur Pendleton, Martha Higgins, and even the smallest children remind us that dignity, love, and justice are far more powerful than fear, greed, or social status. True wealth lies not in silver or acres, but in the capacity to extend kindness, to honor the humanity of others, and to act in service to those who cannot defend themselves. In this dusty corner of Texas, we are reminded that one brave act of goodness, one choice to lift someone from despair, can echo across generations, shaping lives in ways we may never fully understand. As the night stretches across the prairie, the lesson is clear. Compassion is timeless, courage is measured in deeds, and the bonds we forge through love and empathy define the legacy we leave behind. May we all carry this truth in our hearts, striving to see beyond the immediate struggles and offering our hands to those in need.